The Lancaster bombers shuddered violently as flak burst around them like angry fireflies in the night sky. Flight Lieutenant Edward Marlowe pressed his face against the navigation table, watching his instruments spin uselessly. The needle of his radio compass dead, the radar screen nothing but static snow. They were somewhere over the North Sea with 5 other bombers following their lead, and he had just lost every modern tool that stood between them and a watery grave. Then he looked down at the paper map beneath his hands, its wax-coated surface catching the faint glow of his penlight, and an impossible idea began to form. What he did next with that torn corner of paper would be remembered as either brilliance or madness, but in that moment, with German fighters somewhere in the darkness and fuel running low, Eddy Marlowe didn't have the luxury of doubt. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The evening of April 14th, 1942, started like so many others at RAF Waddington. Edward Marlowe, 26 years old, with sandy hair that never quite stayed in regulation and eyes that seemed perpetually focused on some distant calculation, sat in the briefing room alongside 200 other airmen. The air smelled of cigarette smoke, nervous sweat, and the peculiar mixture of hope and dread that preceded every mission. Maps covered the walls, red strings marking routes across the North Sea into enemy territory. Tonight's target was the German naval base at Kiel, a heavily defended port that had already claimed dozens of RAF aircraft. Eddy's pilot, squadron leader James Whitmore, sat beside him, methodically cleaning his pipe despite the no-smoking order that would come into effect once they reached their aircraft. Whitmore was 31, ancient by bomber crew standards, with a weathered face that had seen too many friends fail to return from milk runs that should have been simple. He had flown with Eddy for 18 months, long enough to trust the navigator's instincts even when they contradicted the instruments. "Weather's going to be rough over the target," Whitmore murmured, his voice barely audible under the briefing officer's lecture. "Wind shear and cloud cover. Navigation's going to be hell." Eddy nodded, his fingers already tracing potential contingencies on his knee pad. He had a habit of planning for disasters that might never happen, a trait that had earned him the nickname Pessimist Eddy among the younger crews. The older crews, the ones who had survived long enough to see optimists turn into statistics, called him Lucky Eddy instead. He wasn't sure which name he preferred, but he knew which one kept you alive longer. The briefing officer, a wing commander with 3 distinguished flying crosses and a limp from a crash landing in 1940, outlined their approach vector. 6 Lancaster bombers would fly in loose formation, dropping incendiaries followed by high explosives on the U-boat pens. Expected losses were listed as moderate, which everyone in the room understood meant at least 2 aircraft wouldn't come home. The trick was making sure you weren't in one of them. After the briefing, Eddy gathered his equipment with the ritualistic precision that had become second nature. His navigation case held charts, pencils, a circular slide rule, dividers, and the precious sextant that allowed him to navigate by the stars when radio beacons failed. He checked each item twice, then checked again. His Mae West life preserver went on over his flight suit, followed by the bulky parachute harness that dug into his shoulders. Every movement was automatic, muscle memory built from 2 years of operations that had transformed an Oxford mathematics student into someone who could calculate bombing vectors while flak tore holes in the aircraft around him. The walk to Lancaster Victor Baker felt longer than usual. The aircraft sat on the hard stand like a massive black bird, its 4 Merlin engines already warm from the ground crew's pre-flight checks. Eddy climbed through the hatch and made his way to his station behind the cockpit, a cramped space dominated by the navigation table and its hooded lamp. The table's surface was already marked with pencil lines from previous missions, ghostly traces of journeys that other navigators had plotted. He wondered if any of those men were still alive, then pushed the thought away. That kind of thinking would kill you faster than German fighters. Whitmore's voice crackled through the intercom as the engines coughed to life, one after another, their combined roar making the fuselage shake. "Navigation check, Eddy." "Navigation ready, Skipper." Eddy's reply was automatic as he verified his instruments one final time. The radio compass showed green. The G-Box radar navigation system flickered to life, its pulses painting a reassuring picture of the English coast. Everything looked good. Everything always looked good before things went wrong. They took off at 2100 hours, the Lancaster heavy with fuel and bombs, clawing its way into the darkening sky. Eddy watched the fields of Lincolnshire drop away beneath them, the familiar patchwork of hedgerows and villages giving way to the gray waters of the North Sea. He marked their departure time and heading, beginning the continuous process of dead reckoning that would occupy every moment of the flight. Position, wind drift, ground speed, fuel consumption. The numbers flowed through his mind in an endless stream, each calculation building on the last, creating a chain of logic that connected them to home. The formation assembled over the coast, 6 Lancasters stacking up in a loose gaggle that balanced defensive firepower against the risk of collision in the darkness. Eddy could see the silhouettes of the other bombers through his small window, black shapes against the slightly less black sky. Somewhere in those aircraft were navigators doing the same calculations he was, plotting the same course, hoping their numbers were right. The flight across the North Sea should have been routine. They had done it dozens of times, following radio beacons and radar fixes that turned the featureless water into a highway as reliable as any road. But 40 minutes into the crossing, Eddy noticed something wrong. The G-box screen, which should have shown sharp pulses from the British transmitters, was beginning to fuzz. He adjusted the controls, thinking it was atmospheric interference, but the signal continued to degrade. "Skipper, I'm getting interference on the G," he reported, keeping his voice level despite the anxiety crawling up his spine. "Might be German jamming. Can you work around it?" Whitmore's question carried the weight of 6 aircraft and 36 lives. "Trying, Skipper." Eddy switched frequencies, hunting for a clear signal. The Germans had gotten better at electronic warfare, filling the air with noise that turned precise navigation aids into useless static. He found a weak signal from a different transmitter and began taking fixes, but he knew it wouldn't last. The enemy was learning, adapting, making every mission harder than the last. 20 minutes later, the G-box died completely, its screen dissolving into meaningless snow. Eddy switched to the radio compass, which still showed a bearing toward Kiel, and continued his dead reckoning with increased vigilance. They had trained for this. Loss of electronic navigation was always a possibility. He had his charts, his sextant, and his mind. Those had been enough for centuries of sailors before him. They would be enough now. The German coast appeared as a dark line on the horizon, marked by searchlights that swept the sky in lazy patterns. Eddy gave Whitmore a heading correction, and the formation adjusted course toward Kiel. The searchlights grew brighter, more numerous, and then the first flock bloomed beneath them, a flower of orange fire that left purple afterimages in Eddy's vision. "Flak, 7 o'clock low," the rear gunner called. His voice was young, barely 19, but steady with the false calm that came from having no other choice. More bursts followed, walking up toward their altitude. The Lancaster bucked and shuddered as shrapnel rattled against its skin. Eddy gripped his table, keeping his pencil steady on the chart, maintaining the plot that would get them home. A calculator could not afford to flinch. They reached the target at 23:15 hours. The U-boat pens were visible as rectangular shadows against the burning city, already hit by the Pathfinder aircraft that had marked the target with incendiaries. Whitmore put the Lancaster into its bombing run, flying straight and level despite the flak that had intensified into a solid wall of exploding steel. The bombardier called out adjustments, his voice mechanical with concentration. Left, steady, steady, bombs gone. The Lancaster leaped upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosives fell away. Whitmore immediately threw the aircraft into a diving turn, breaking away from the target as more flak reached up toward them. Eddy felt his stomach drop, his instruments momentarily useless as the artificial horizon spun. Then they were level again, racing away from Kiel with the rest of the formation, and he began plotting their course home. That was when everything fell apart. The explosion came from somewhere behind them, close enough that Eddy felt the heat through the fuselage. The Lancaster yawed violently to the right, and every light in Eddy's navigation station died. Emergency lighting flickered on, painting everything in ghostly red, but his instruments remained dark. The radio compass needle spun lazily, pointing everywhere and nowhere. The intercom filled with damage reports, voices overlapping in controlled panic. "Fire in number 3 engine, Skipper." "I've got it, feathering now." "Hydraulics are hit. partial loss of elevator control. Eddy's hands moved automatically, checking each instrument. Radio compass dead. G-box dead, though that had been useless anyway. Altimeter working. Airspeed indicator working. Compass working, though magnetic compasses were notoriously unreliable during violent maneuvers. He had lost every electronic navigation aid simultaneously, which meant electrical damage, probably from a night fighter's cannon fire, though no one had called out an attack. Eddy, I need a heading home. Whitmore's voice cut through the chaos with the authority of a man who had survived by staying calm when everyone else panicked. We're leading the formation out. Whatever you've got, I need it now. Leading the formation. That was the detail that transformed a bad situation into a potential catastrophe. The other 5 Lancasters were following Victor Baker because Whitmore was the formation leader. If Eddy got their navigation wrong, 6 aircraft would fly the wrong heading, and 63 men would vanish into the North Sea when their fuel ran out. The weight of those lives settled onto his shoulders like a physical burden. He pulled out his chart and spread it on the table under the red emergency lights. His last solid position had been over Kiel 2 minutes ago. He knew their approximate heading during the escape turn, their airspeed, the wind conditions from the meteorological briefing. He could dead reckon a rough course back toward England, but rough wasn't good enough. The North Sea was 300 miles of featureless water, where being off by even a few degrees meant missing the British coast entirely. The sextant sat in its case at his feet. In peacetime, celestial navigation was a leisurely art, taking star sights with careful precision, working through tables of calculations to determine position. In wartime, in a damaged bomber, with German fighters possibly still hunting and fuel steadily burning away, it was almost impossible. But almost impossible was better than definitely dead. Eddy grabbed the sextant and made his way to the Astrodome, a clear bubble on top of the fuselage normally used by gunners watching for fighters. He squeezed through the narrow passage, his parachute harness catching on every projection, and pushed his head up into the dome. The slipstream howled around him, cold air at minus 20 degrees turning his breath into ice crystals. Above, the stars shone with diamond brilliance, untouched by the war below. He raised the sextant and tried to take a sight on Polaris. The aircraft lurched, still unstable from the battle damage, and the star slipped out of his field of view. He tried again, bracing himself against the frame of the dome, fighting to keep the sextant steady while the Lancaster wallowed through the sky. The star's altitude should tell him their latitude, give him at least one line of position, but he needed the horizon to measure against. In daylight over water, the horizon was clear. At night, it was invisible. Eddy stared at the sextant in his hands, an instrument designed for ships that didn't pitch and roll like damaged aircraft, that had a visible horizon to measure against. Useless. The beautiful precision tool was useless without the references it needed. He fought back the despair that threatened to swamp his thinking. There had to be a way. Mathematics didn't care about circumstances. The stars were still there, their positions immutable, governed by laws that predated the war and would outlast it. If he could measure their angles, he could find their position. The problem was the reference point. He slid back down from the dome and returned to his navigation station, his mind racing. The other navigators would be trying the same thing, fighting the same problems, potentially making the same mistakes. If he didn't give Whitmore a reliable heading soon, the squadron leader would have to make his best guess and hope. Hope was not a navigation strategy. Eddy spread his chart on the table and stared at it, seeing not just the blue expanse of the North Sea, but the paper itself. The charts were printed on special paper, wax-treated to resist water and oil, with a slightly glossy surface that reflected light. He had noticed it 1,000 times without really thinking about it, the way the paper caught the glow from his hooded lamp, the way pencil marks could be erased cleanly because the graphite didn't penetrate the wax coating. Reflective. The paper was reflective. An idea bloomed in his mind, so absurd that he almost dismissed it immediately. But desperation made absurd ideas worth considering. The paper reflected light. Not perfectly, not like a mirror, but enough. If he could create an artificial horizon using the paper's reflectivity, he could take a star sight. The wax coating was thin enough to be translucent if backlit, which meant it might work. His hands moved before his conscious mind had fully approved the plan. He took his penlight and held it against the back of the chart, illuminating a section of the paper from behind. The wax coating glowed faintly, creating a visible edge where the backlit paper met the darkness. He tore a corner off the chart, a roughly triangular piece about 3 inches on each side, and held it up. Through the sextant's optics, the illuminated edge created a line, a makeshift horizon floating in space. It was insane. It violated every principle of proper celestial navigation. The edge wasn't level, wasn't stable, wasn't any of the things a horizon should be. But it was visible, and visible meant measurable. If he could hold the paper steady enough, angle the backlight correctly, he could measure the angle between his improvised horizon and Polaris. The measurement would be crude, probably accurate to plus or minus a degree at best, but 1 degree of latitude was 60 nautical miles. That was better than nothing. That might be enough. "Skipper, I need 5 minutes of stable flight," Eddy called into the intercom. "Best course you can estimate toward England. I'm going to try something." "You've got it, Eddy." Whitmore didn't ask questions. That was why they worked well together. Trust went both ways. Eddy climbed back to the Astrodome, carrying his sextant, the torn paper, and his penlight. The cold hit him again, stealing his breath, but he ignored it. He had 5 minutes. 5 minutes to perform a navigation technique that didn't exist in any manual, using equipment that was never designed for this purpose, to save 6 aircraft and their crews. He positioned the paper in his left hand, holding the penlight behind it with his thumb. The wax-coated edge glowed dimly in the darkness. With his right hand, he raised the sextant and found Polaris through the optics. The star blazed clear and steady, a fixed point in the turning universe. Slowly, carefully, he adjusted the sextant's arm until Polaris appeared to sit exactly on the glowing edge of his improvised horizon. The Lancaster bounced through turbulence, and the star slipped away. Eddy cursed and found it again. "Hold steady. Just hold steady for 10 seconds. He watched Polaris dance along the paper's edge, waiting for a moment of calm. The aircraft steadied, Whitmore's skill keeping them level, and Eddy read the angle. 53 degrees, maybe 53.5. He took 2 more sights to verify, getting 52 degrees 40 minutes and 53 degrees 10 minutes. Close enough? He was working with rough tools. He couldn't expect precise answers. He dropped back down to his station and grabbed his navigation tables. Polaris's altitude roughly equaled their latitude. If he was at 53 degrees north, he could use that information with his dead reckoning to plot a position. He marked a line across his chart at 53 degrees. They were somewhere on that line. The question was where. For longitude, he needed a different star, something east or west whose position changed with time. He returned to the Astrodome and found Betelgeuse, the red giant in Orion's shoulder. Using the same technique, paper and penlight, creating a false horizon, he took 3 more sights. The process was getting easier with practice, though his hands were going numb from the cold. Back at the navigation table, he worked through the calculations, his pencil scratching across the chart in the red emergency lighting. The numbers came together slowly, hampered by the crude measurements and the constant aircraft motion. But they came together. 2 position lines crossed on his chart at a point roughly 140 miles northeast of the British coast. He marked it with a small cross, then drew a course line from that position to Waddington. 220 degrees magnetic, allowing for wind drift. Error factor potentially high, but it was a course. "Skipper, I've got a heading." Eddy's voice sounded strange in his own ears, rough with cold and stress. "Come right to 220 magnetic. Range to home approximately 280 miles. 220 magnetic, confirmed." Whitmore banked the Lancaster onto the new heading. "How confident are you?" 60%, Skipper. Honesty was important when lives depended on your answers. "I had to improvise, but it's better than guessing. 60% beats 0. We'll check when we get closer to land." The formation followed them onto the new heading, 6 Lancasters threading their way through the darkness on nothing but faith in Eddy's improvised navigation. He kept working, taking more star sights every 15 minutes, refining his position. The technique became smoother with repetition. Hold the paper steady, find the star, read the angle, work the numbers. Each fix confirmed they were roughly on course, though the error margins made him nervous. They could be 10 miles off, 20 miles off, even 30 miles off. But they were pointed generally toward England, rather than wandering into the endless North Sea or accidentally flying into occupied Europe. An hour passed. Fuel gauges showed the reserve tanks nearly empty. the main tanks draining steadily. They had enough for perhaps another 90 minutes of flight, which should be enough if Eddy's navigation was right. Should be. He pushed the uncertainty aside and focused on the next star site. The rear gunner's voice cracked through the intercom, sharp with urgency. "Fighter! Fighter! 8 o'clock high!" Eddy felt the Lancaster roll into evasive maneuvers, his careful navigation chart sliding across the table. He grabbed it before it could fall, pressing it flat, maintaining the thread of their position even as the aircraft bucked and twisted. The guns opened up, tracers arcing into the darkness. The fighter made one pass, two passes, then broke away. Maybe it was low on ammunition, maybe the formation's concentrated defensive fire had discouraged it. Either way, they were still flying. "Damage report," Whitmore called. The crew checked in one by one. Holes in the tail section, more hydraulic fluid leaking. The electrical system still dead. But the engines ran, the controls responded, and they were still in the air, still flying the heading Eddy had given them, trusting his impossible navigation method. At 0130 hours, the wireless operator called out, "I'm getting a faint signal on the emergency frequency. Sounds like a British beacon bearing 215. Eddy's heart leaped. A British beacon meant they were close enough to the coast to pick up friendly signals. He took a radio bearing with the manual direction finder, a backup system that didn't require the main electrical system. 215. He plotted it on his chart. The line of bearing crossed his estimated position at a point that made sense, that confirmed his star navigation had been roughly accurate. "Skipper, adjust heading to 215. We should make landfall in approximately 30 miles. 20 minutes later, the coast appeared, a black line against the slightly less black sea, marked by the shaded lights of coastal towns. Eddy had never seen anything more beautiful. He took a bearing on a lighthouse he recognized and plotted their exact position. They were 14 miles north of where he had expected, an error of roughly 2 degrees over 200 miles of ocean. Given the crude methods he had used, that was remarkably good. That was, he had to admit, a minor miracle. Whitmore guided the formation down the coast to Waddington. The landing lights came on as they approached, a string of emeralds in the darkness. One by one, the Lancasters settled onto the runway, their crews exhausted, grateful, and alive. Victor Baker was the last to land, touching down with a bounce that suggested damaged landing gear. But they were down. They were home. Eddy gathered his equipment with hands that shook from adrenaline and exhaustion. The torn corner of the navigation chart, his improvised horizon, was still in his pocket. He looked at it in the crew room light, an irregular scrap of wax-coated paper that had somehow saved 6 aircraft. The other navigators clustered around as he explained what he had done, their faces showing a mixture of disbelief and dawning respect. "You navigated by starlight using a piece of torn paper?" one of them asked, a young officer who still looked like he should be in school. "It was all I had," Eddy said simply. "The math is the same whether you're using proper instruments or improvising. You just have to adapt to circumstances." The intelligence officers wanted every detail for their reports. The squadron commander, a group captain with a distinguished service order and a reputation for not suffering fools, listened to Eddy's explanation with increasing interest. "Show me," he said, handing Eddy a chart. Eddy demonstrated the technique, using a desk lamp as a substitute for a pen light, holding the paper to create a glowing edge. The group captain took a sight on a light fixture, worked through the basic calculations, and nodded slowly. "Crude, but functional. The error margins are high, but for emergency navigation over water, this could work." He looked at Eddy with something approaching approval. "You've stumbled onto something useful, Flight Lieutenant. I'm going to pass this up the chain. If nothing else, it should be taught as a backup technique." Within a week, Eddy found himself at RAF Bomber Command Headquarters, demonstrating his improvised navigation method to a room full of senior officers and navigation specialists. Some were skeptical, pointing out the obvious limitations, but others recognized the value of any technique that might save crews when their electronic systems failed. Electronic warfare was getting more sophisticated every month. The Germans were learning to jam and deceive British navigation aids. Having a fallback method that required nothing but a chart, a light, and a sextant could mean the difference between returning home and vanishing into the ocean. The Air Ministry's navigation experts refined Eddy's technique, developing specific procedures and practice methods. They created training scenarios where crews had to navigate after losing all electronic systems, forcing navigators to master celestial navigation under pressure. The wax paper artificial horizon became an official backup technique taught to every navigator class. They even developed specialized paper with enhanced reflective properties, though Eddy noted with amusement that standard navigation charts worked perfectly well. Eddy flew 23 more missions before his tour ended. He carried a piece of torn chart paper in his pocket on every flight, a talisman that reminded him that intelligence and improvisation could overcome desperate circumstances. Other crews started adopting the same habit, carrying their own scraps of paper marked with small crosses or initials, personal good luck charms that acknowledged what had come to be called Marlowe's paper map miracle. The technique saved lives. In July of 1942, a damaged Wellington bomber over the Mediterranean used the method to reach Malta after its instruments failed. In September, a Sterling crew navigated home from Berlin through heavy clouds using star shots taken through brief breaks. In November, 3 Lancasters from a damaged formation followed their navigators' improvised celestial navigation to safety when German jamming made radio navigation impossible. Each success reinforced the value of teaching crews to think beyond their instruments, to understand the underlying mathematics that made navigation possible. Eddy received a Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions on the Kiel raid, though he felt uncomfortable with the attention. He had simply done what seemed necessary at the time, applying his mathematical training to solve an immediate problem. That it had worked seemed less like brilliance and more like luck, though he had to admit the line between the two was often blurry. Good luck was frequently nothing more than preparation meeting opportunity. After his tour ended, Eddy transferred to a training role, teaching navigation to new crews. He insisted that every student learn celestial navigation thoroughly, not just as academic exercise, but as practical survival skill. Electronics could fail, radios could be jammed, but the stars would always be there, constant and reliable, waiting for anyone with the knowledge to read them. He developed a training exercise he called the Paper Horizon Challenge, where students had to take star sights using improvised equipment under simulated emergency conditions. Most failed the first time, their hands shaking too much. Their calculations rushed and error-filled, but with practice, they improved. They learned that panic was the enemy of good navigation, that clear thinking under pressure was as important as mathematical skill. Years after the war ended, Eddy taught navigation at Oxford, the university he had left in 1939 to join the RAF. His students, who had never seen combat, never felt the bone-deep terror of flying through flak, sometimes struggled to understand why he insisted on teaching backup methods and emergency techniques. Modern aircraft had sophisticated electronic navigation systems. Why bother learning celestial navigation at all? Because systems fail, Eddy would tell them, holding up the preserved corner of a navigation chart, now mounted in a small frame on his office wall. In 1942, this piece of paper was the difference between 63 men going home and 63 men dying in the North Sea. Electronics are wonderful when they work, but when they don't work, you need to understand the fundamental principles. Mathematics doesn't care about your equipment. The stars don't care about your electronics. If you understand the underlying reality, you can navigate with anything. The paper map miracle became part of RAF legend. One of those stories that proved human ingenuity could trump technology, that quick thinking mattered as much as fancy equipment. Navigation instructors taught it for decades, often adding embellishments that made the story more dramatic than it had been. Eddy, who had lived through the actual event, found the embellishments amusing. The reality had been desperate enough without exaggeration. In 1973, the RAF Historical Branch interviewed Eddy for their oral history project. By then he was 57, a respected academic with a lifetime of accomplishments, but the interviewer wanted to hear about one night in April of 1942. Eddy described the mission in detail, trying to convey both the fear and the mechanical focus required to navigate under such conditions. "Were you confident the technique would work?" the interviewer asked. Eddy considered the question carefully. "Confident? No, I was terrified it wouldn't work, but I was more terrified of doing nothing. The mathematics were sound in principle. The execution was questionable, but questionable beats hopeless. When you're faced with impossible choices, you choose the option that gives you any chance of success. however small. Do you think anyone else would have thought of using the chart paper that way? Probably. Necessity is quite inventive. I happened to be the one holding a map when I needed a reflective surface. Someone else might have used a mess tin or a window or something else. The specific solution matters less than the willingness to improvise, to look at your available resources and think creatively about how to use them. The interviewer mentioned that navigation instructors called the technique Marlowe's method. Eddy winced slightly at that. He had never sought recognition, never wanted his name attached to what had been a desperate improvisation born of immediate need. But names stuck, and if having his name on a survival technique meant that future crews remembered to think creatively under pressure, he supposed he could live with the mild embarrassment. James Whitmore, the pilot who had trusted Eddy's improvised navigation that night, remained a friend until his death in 1968. They met regularly, along with other surviving crew members, and rarely talked about the war. The missions they had flown together existed in memory as both incredibly vivid and strangely distant, events that had happened to the younger versions of themselves. But occasionally, usually after a few drinks, someone would mention the Kiel raid, and they would discuss what had really happened that night. "I knew you were making it up as you went along," Whitmore said once, his weathered face creasing with a smile. "The confidence in your voice was just a bit too forced, but I also knew you were smart enough to make it up well. That's what mattered." "I was terrified of leading you wrong," Eddy admitted. 6 aircraft following my guesswork. It wasn't guesswork. It was educated estimation using improvised tools. There's a difference. Perhaps there was. Eddy had spent decades teaching that difference to students, explaining that navigation was fundamentally about making the best possible estimate given available information, then constantly updating that estimate as new information arrived. Perfect accuracy was impossible. Good enough accuracy, achieved through sound methods and clear thinking, was all you needed. The other navigators from that mission also went on to distinguished careers. 2 died in subsequent raids before the war ended, their luck running out over Germany. The other 3 survived and maintained contact with Eddy over the years. They sometimes joked about being members of an exclusive club, the Paper Map Survivors, men who had reached England through improvised celestial navigation when all their electronic systems failed. One of them, a squadron leader named Richard Pemberton, later commanded a navigation training school and made Eddy's technique a core part of the curriculum. "Every navigator who goes through my school learns to navigate with a torn piece of paper and a flashlight," he told Eddy during a reunion. "Most of them think it's silly until I explain what happened to us. Then they pay attention. Fear is a wonderful teacher." In his later years, Eddy often reflected on that night over the North Sea, analyzing his decisions with the benefit of hindsight. He could identify errors in his calculations, places where he should have been more careful, assumptions that turned out to be wrong but happened to cancel each other out. Luck had played a role alongside skill, but he had given luck a chance to work by refusing to give up, by searching for any possible solution, no matter how unlikely. That lesson, more than the specific navigation technique, was what he tried to pass on to his students. Technical knowledge was important, mathematical skill was essential, but neither mattered if you panicked when things went wrong. The ability to think clearly under pressure, to analyze problems methodically even when fear tried to shut down rational thought, was the difference between navigators who survived and those who didn't. He kept the torn corner of the navigation chart on his office wall until his death in 1987. Students would ask about it, and he would tell the story. Though always emphasizing the contributions of his crew, the skill of Whitmore who kept the damaged Lancaster flying, the luck that had placed him in the right position at the right time with the right pieces of knowledge. He had been one man doing one job during one mission. That it had turned into legend felt strange, as though it had happened to someone else. The Royal Air Force Museum eventually acquired the chart fragment, displaying it alongside other navigation instruments from World War II. The small brass plaque beneath it reads, "Improvised artificial horizon used by Flight Lieutenant E.R. Marlowe during emergency navigation, April 14, 1942. This piece of wax-coated paper allowed Marlowe to perform celestial navigation after his Lancaster bomber lost all electronic systems, leading 6 aircraft safely home across the North Sea. His technique became standard emergency training in RAF Bomber Command. Thousands of visitors see that display every year, most passing by with barely a glance, some stopping to read the plaque and marvel that something so simple could be so important. The few who understand navigation, who recognize the desperate circumstances that made such improvisation necessary, tend to stare at the fragment longer, imagining the fear and focus required to navigate using such crude tools. The paper map miracle became more than a story about one night's navigation. It became a parable about human ingenuity, about the importance of understanding fundamental principles rather than just memorizing procedures, about refusing to give up when systems failed. Military academies taught it in leadership courses, using Eddy's example to illustrate creative problem-solving under pressure. Engineering schools taught it to demonstrate why understanding underlying mathematics mattered more than trusting instruments. Eddy himself remained modest about his role, always quick to point out that he had simply applied standard celestial navigation in non-standard circumstances. The wax paper hadn't done anything magical. It had merely provided a visible edge to measure angles against, allowing him to use tools and knowledge he already possessed. Any competent navigator could have done the same thing if they had thought of it, but that was the point other people tried to make to him. Thinking of it was the hard part. Seeing the solution in the torn corner of a map when panic would have been the more natural response. Trusting mathematical principles when every instinct screamed that they couldn't possibly work with such crude tools. That combination of knowledge, creativity, and courage was rare enough to be remarkable. The story endured because it offered hope during a period when survival often seemed to depend entirely on luck. It reminded crews that their training mattered, that their intelligence could be as valuable as their equipment, that they had more control over their fate than they sometimes felt. In a war where so much seemed random and meaningless, where good crews died while incompetent ones survived, Eddy's story suggested that skill and quick thinking could tip the scales. Looking back across the decades from his Oxford office, Eddy wondered sometimes what would have happened if he hadn't noticed the reflective quality of the map paper, if he had given Whitmore a guessed heading instead of attempting the star shots. Would they have made it home anyway through blind luck? Would all 6 aircraft have vanished into the North Sea, becoming statistics in the growing list of bombers that never returned? There was no way to know, no alternate timeline to compare against reality. What he did know was that desperation had forced him to think beyond standard procedures, to look at available resources with fresh eyes, to remember that tools were just tools, but principles were eternal. The stars had been navigational aids for thousands of years before electronics existed. The mathematics of position finding hadn't changed because someone invented radio. By returning to those fundamentals, he had found a path through seemingly impossible circumstances. That lesson stayed with him throughout his life, influencing how he taught, how he approached problems, how he advised students facing their own difficulties. When systems failed, when standard solutions didn't work, when circumstances seemed hopeless, look at what you have and think creatively about how to use it. Knowledge was portable. Understanding was adaptable. Fear was the enemy, not the situation. The navigators who learned his technique, who practiced taking star sights with improvised horizons, probably never needed to use it in actual emergency. Electronic navigation systems became more reliable after the war, backup systems more sophisticated, but they learned something more valuable than a specific skill. They learned that they could navigate even when everything went wrong, that their own intelligence and training gave them power over circumstances, that they were not helpless victims of equipment failures. In the end, that confidence might have been the real miracle. Not the torn paper or the improvised star sights, but the knowledge that when faced with impossible situations, human beings could adapt and improvise and find solutions that didn't exist in any manual. Eddy had proved it over the North Sea in April of 1942, and hundreds of navigators after him had practiced the proof, carrying the lesson forward into situations he could never have imagined. The paper map miracle began as desperate improvisation and became doctrine, which was perhaps the most appropriate legacy. Good ideas often emerged from necessity, from moments when standard procedures failed, and someone had to think beyond their training. The genius lay not in having perfect solutions, but in recognizing that imperfect solutions were good enough when they were all you had. 60% confidence beat 0% confidence. An improvised artificial horizon beat no horizon at all. Trying something unlikely beat doing nothing. As Eddy told his students in his final lecture before retirement, navigation is about getting from where you are to where you want to be using whatever information and tools you have available. Sometimes you have sophisticated instruments and perfect data. Sometimes you have a torn piece of paper and desperate hope. The fundamental task doesn't change. You observe, you calculate, you correct, and you trust the mathematics. Everything else is just detail. The students applauded politely, not quite understanding that they had just received the condensed wisdom of a man who had navigated through one of history's most desperate wars. But some of them would remember. Some of them would face their own moments of crisis, their own equipment failures, their own impossible situations. And perhaps they would think of a young navigator over the North Sea, holding a scrap of paper against the stars, refusing to give up when every reason to surrender screamed at him. That was the real legacy of Marlowe's paper map miracle, beyond the techniques and the training and the military citations. One man's refusal to accept the impossible had rippled forward through time, teaching generations that creativity and determination could overcome circumstances. That understanding principles mattered more than memorizing procedures, that the human mind was still the most sophisticated navigation instrument ever created. The torn corner of a wax-coated map had guided 6 bombers home through the darkness. But the idea behind it, the fundamental truth that knowledge and improvisation could save lives when technology failed, had guided countless others through their own darknesses ever since. And perhaps that was miracle enough.